Welcome to the fourth ever episode of the Revolution Today podcast. This episode is once again sponsored by the grateful people on my Patreon who support me every month. Without those people, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. So if you would like to go and donate and support me every month, links down in the description. That is patreon.com/revolutiontoday. Today we are talking about the Afghanistan conflict, controversy, situation, and really the history of how it all began and how the United States played a big part in what, what spiraled into what it become today. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I wanted to talk about the Afghanistan situation because to me, I felt like it's important because it's very prevalent and it's very much a part of our lives. Even though for a lot of us, we never went to war there. We never been shipped off there. And we never really fought overseas there, like personally. But for our country, we've spent the government has spent a lot of our tax dollars overseas in Afghanistan for the war. And so it kind of is a little personal because it's our own money that was spent on this war and it was used against us. So it is personal in a sense, although we haven't, a lot of us personally haven't went overseas to fight that war, but it's still personal because they spent our money, they used our own tax dollars, they've foregone any sort of acknowledgement of our own problems here at home and decided that a war in Afghanistan was more important. But anyway, I wanted to get into this because it's all over the news and it's something that should be talked about because it's very important, especially for those of us who were old enough to remember or not old enough to remember this war kind of starting off, and being around when the war first began. I wasn't really old enough to remember too much, but I just know that like after 9/11, this is when it all really started. But if we really want to understand the whole conflict with the Taliban and what's going on in the present, you got to look into the history. Now, if you go back to 1978. 1978 was a crucial year within the Middle East. The Soviet Union became more imperialistic as time went on. I mean, let's be real. The whole goal of socialism is to just not be imperialist. Imperialism is a direct conflict with socialism. In fact, imperialism is related to capitalism. So for socialism to exist, imperialism cannot exist. But with the Soviet Union, they became more imperialistic as time went on, as well as more capitalist as time went on. But that's a whole nother story. I don't want to get into that right now. But 1978 was the year that started it all, really in the Middle East. The Soviet Union intervenes in Afghanistan. They marched into Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan in 1979. Okay. So, they went in with their tanks, their soldiers, their helicopters, your usual. And they went in there and they occupied and captured Afghanistan and, took over the land. And as you can see, it began in 1979, and it kept going all the way up until 1989. Under Soviet rule, things were pretty much all right. Women had rights. Everyone was doing amazing. I think it was perfectly fine. I think it's complicated because during the rule of the Soviets in Afghanistan, things were looking pretty good. Women had rights. Everybody was healthy. There was a lot of hope in the future for Afghanistan, because it seemed as if they were on the up. But there's a player in this game that showed up, the Islamic Mujahideen fighters. Now, the Mujahideen fighters were armed rebels that were against the Soviet army and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which was the socialist ruling party of Afghanistan during that Soviet-Afghan war. Now, the Mujahideen consisted of different members and different groups of different ethnicities and ideological backgrounds. But what we want to focus on is not the Mujahideen themselves, like their background and their history, but we want to focus on the Mujahideen as a whole in their current fight. So they fought against the Soviets, and they were fighting against the Soviets in 1979, leading on. So, and then you have Pakistan's president, Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq. He feared that the Soviets were going to invade Balochistan in Pakistan. So he sent one of his, I want to say, one of his, Joint Chiefs of Staff's committee members. He was a general. He sent him to Saudi Arabia to get support to fight against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And then, a while later, the U.S. government, the CIA, they joined in, and they started putting money. They started funding the Mujahideen fighters by giving them equipment, weapons, tanks, choppers, whatever they could get. They put in the hands of the Mujahideen fighters. And the Mujahideen fighters, believe it or not, were actually invited to the White House under Reagan. That's insane. The Mujahideen fighters were invited to the White House under Reagan. There's a famous picture where Reagan's meeting with the leaders of the Mujahideen fighters, the rebels, and he's meeting with them to talk about, funding them and helping them stop the Soviets from taking over the Middle East. And this is where it all begins. Okay, the Mujahideen gladly accept the weapons, the supplies, the money. They take what they can get. Now, if you don't know, the Mujahideen fighters, there's a very famous person who was a part of this group. This group was pro, like, hardcore Islam and anti-communist, obviously. But this group, there's a famous person who was a part of this group that they funded. I am 100% certain that in this group, Osama bin Laden was a member. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure he was a member, because I remember seeing a picture of him way back in the day. And he was one of the members of this group and one of the fighters in this group. And yes, he was. He was a member of this group. He was a fighter. And the United States government back in the 80s, 79, late, like last year, the 70s into the 80s, they funded the Mujahideen fighters to take on the Soviets in the Middle East. And let's just say that was a bad choice. In my opinion, we never should have done it. But then again, that was back at the time when everybody was, when all these conservatives and everybody were just all fear-mongering and fighting again and pushing this anti-communist propaganda, against the Soviet Union and painting them as the evil bad guy. So I understand why. I mean, I don't support that. I don't support that they did that. But I do understand why. It does make sense why they did it. Although I don't support them doing that at all. I don't think that the government should have ever funded the Mujahideen fighters, but I do understand at in the time, it was the Cold War, everybody was on edge. Soviet Union was painted as the bad guy, propaganda all over the place. So for them, it was like it makes sense for the time, although it was a bad idea. So the United States funds these Mujahideen fighters to go take on the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and war rages on, and it could have gone on for a lot longer. I mean, it ended in 1989, but it could have continued for far longer than it did. The only thing that stopped the war in the Middle East with the Soviets was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is a whole nother topic. I don't want to get into that because that was all, you know, played in part thanks to the CIA and the United States government sabotaging it. But I don't want to get into that because it's a whole nother topic. So the Mujahideen fighters, they fight on and on and on to the end of 1989 when the Soviet Union collapses in that around that time. So then the Soviet Union's done in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's on its own. And then in 1992, around 1989 is when it kind of like slowed down. It didn't finish. It didn't end in 1989, but it slowed down to the point where once the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, that's when it stopped. But then in 1992, there was a civil war in Afghanistan. After the Soviet regime, that they call it, was eliminated. Many political parties had an agreement on being peaceful and trying to share power, to kind of keep things stable. And then it created a new state, actually, the Islamic State of Afghanistan, which started in 1992. And then they kept going and going and going, and then there was some conflict with militias. Militias were fighting, and that escalated into war. So then it became a civil war. So they didn't have. So with this new government, actually, with the new government, they didn't have time to form any police or any sort of like justice systems, and so they didn't have time to form. So different factions were committing these atrocities, and it was just insane. And so they were trying to create ceasefires, negotiate peace deals within these different with these different states of representatives of the government. Those all collapsed and failed, and so they all just failed. There was no peace deals, and so all these militias and factions were just fighting. But these local leaders these militias were ruling these areas of Afghanistan. There wasn't any really official government ruling of the different cities, and so these local militias were just running things because there was so much instability because the new government that had just formed didn't have time to structure and organize their military, their police forces. They had no time to organize a stable government. So then it fell into civil war, which then allowed these local militias to control most of the local cities and areas that were in Afghanistan, that the government itself had no power to control itself. So the government was losing influence in the end of the country, and the government had no real power. So then this is around the time the Taliban shows up, and their goal was to liberate Afghanistan from the corrupt leaders and warlords that were running things, and they wanted to establish a pure Islamic society. So when you look at it like this, The Taliban was like, hey, the government's corrupt. The government's not doing what it should be doing. This country is not, you know, Islamic. So we want to come in, take over, and restore this country to what it should be. Pure, not corrupt, Islamic, very religious, that sort of thing. So they come back and they come in 1994. They're a bunch of religious students, really. They're very religious. Taliban's highly religious. They come in, they do their thing. That's when they really showed up. So what I'm trying to get at, I'm not trying to go like all deep into the history of the Taliban, but the Taliban started from the Mujahideen fighters who fought the Soviets during the occupation of Afghanistan. And then eventually, once the Soviet Union collapsed, the Mujahideen split up. So you had two factions that split from that. One faction was the Taliban, which we know today, and the other faction was Al Qaeda, who you may know as the group that Osama bin Laden was leading. Now, the Taliban really, the funding the government gave to the Mujahideen fighters, it kind of gave them power, and they kind of took that power that they had and used it to their own advantage to further their own movement. So they basically took the funding we gave them, turned around, backstabbed us, and then started fighting for their own goals and their own reasons. So then they fought from 1994 when they first started. They fought completely, and I'm pretty certain the Taliban gained control. The Taliban gained control in 1996 to 2001. And they had the first government of the Taliban that only lasted from 1996 to 2001. They were very much hyper religious. Now, they were very oppressive, very strict. From what I know, from what I've seen in the news, from different people, the Taliban were very oppressive, like towards women. Women weren't allowed to get education. Women weren't allowed to work. Women had to wear burqas all the time. And they were very, very oppressive towards, what you could say, what you could do. It didn't matter if you were male or female. They're really oppressive on the speech of people. And it was really, so then it was like, now they were being oppressive, far more oppressive than the Soviets ever were, when they invaded. People think, oh, when they hear Soviet Union or they hear Soviet or socialist, they think oppressive. But really, the socialist government that was in power when the Soviets had occupied Afghanistan, life was way better under the Soviet government of Afghanistan than it was under the Taliban in 1996 to 2001. Women were free to do their own thing. Women were free to get education. Women were allowed to do whatever they wanted under the Soviets. And then you come in and then have the Taliban, who were once part of the Mujahideen. They come in and they're like, nope, sorry, we're going back to the old school ways of Islam and religion, and you're not allowed. Women aren't allowed to get education. Women aren't allowed to work. Women are not allowed to do anything, and they have to be accompanied wherever they go by a male husband or guardian. So now you look at it like now you almost sit here and wish the Soviets would have stayed in power, because it would have led to a more stable Afghanistan, a more a more peaceful Afghanistan in a way. I mean, sure, you would have still had the fighters. Um, that wouldn't have been that would have been still commonplace. That would have still been fighting for freedom if the Soviets stayed in power in Afghanistan. But at least society would have been better, and it would have probably been a much better outcome than the United States in occupation. So, the Taliban takes power, forms a government in 1996 to 2001, so long it lasts, and then the United States steps in for a 20-year war. Um, you know, let me see here. Yeah, so the war in Afghanistan started in 2001. The United States steps in. Bush is president. He's like, okay. He's like, well, we're not going to let these terrorists win any longer, because this was after 9/11. He was in the 9/11 speech in the State of the Union, he talked about how we're not going to let these terrorists get away with what they did, and we're gonna make sure they pay, and then we got to go and end the evils of terrorism abroad, and all that stuff. And so that's when we started in 2001. And you know uh it was difficult. I mean, it was a difficult time in those days, because you had many people who were pro-war. They're like, yes, 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 we need to take out the terrorists who did this to us in New York, 9/11. But then you had smart people who were like, well, wait a minute, we don't need to go to war. This is stupid. We shouldn't be going to war in another country, wasting our time and resources. And they were totally right. But at the time, it was like a ridiculous, like, controversial opinion. If you genuinely thought we shouldn't go to war in Afghanistan after 9/11, you were seen as an anti-American traitor. You were not a patriot. You were not a U.S. citizen. Really, that's the way they saw you. So we went to war, despite I mean, a lot of people really had strong opinions on why we shouldn't, but that was drowned out by all the people who wanted to go to war. Um, but we went to war, and get this. I'm not gonna go through the whole history of the Afghan war that we fought, but in Afghanistan, we took over. We put our own puppet government in there, that was all about democracy. Really wasn't, but we did it anyway, and we said it was in the name of democracy, which is a total lie. But we had our own puppet government. We formed. We tried training. We tried forming we formed an army, the Afghan army, and we had to train these Afghan troops, to be able to defend their land from the Taliban and other forces. We spent about $90 billion. I think that's the figure, $90 billion, to train these Afghan troops in Afghanistan to defend and uphold their government's constitution or whatever they had, and to protect their land from the Taliban. I kid you not. Now, this has been in the news. You can even look this up, videos, anything. The moment we announced we were packing up and leaving, the moment Biden said, hey, we're packing up, we're getting out of here, the Taliban started doing their thing. They started marching into the cities, capturing things. And guess what? Those same Afghan soldiers we paid $90 billion to train those same soldiers. Oh, wait, the $90 billion was our tax dollars, by the way. We spent $90 billion in our own tax dollars to train these troops. Those same troops that we spent our tax dollars on to train, they got up and ran away. They were scared. They got up and ran off. And so that's why the Taliban was able to just march right in and take whatever they wanted. Because guess what? Those troops that we trained for $90 billion of our own tax dollars, they up and left. They didn't even put up a fight. So that's already $90 billion down the drain. Not to mention the money we had to spend creating weapons of war, creating propaganda, paying for all these wartime production of vehicles and weapons and utilities and equipment. We spent a lot of money in this war, and think about it, $90 billion alone was spent just to train these lousy Afghan troops. But what happened was the troops ran off. Taliban takes over these cities. They march on to Kabul. And what happens now is the United States is trying to get their embassies all destroyed, destroy any evidence and anything that has to do with U.S. government secrets and government documents. They got to get rid of that. They burn all the American flags, and they got to try to get everybody out before Kabul gets taken over by the Taliban. And then a few days later, Taliban marches in on the presidential palace. They take over, and Kabul is now in the hands of Taliban. So that means Afghanistan is entirely Taliban controlled. And so I didn't want to talk about this. I didn't want to talk about this whole Afghan situation because I wanted to just give a history lesson. Basically, I just wanted to point out how U.S. imperialism is just a failure. U.S. imperialism is a big failure. It hasn't worked ever. And all the times that we've invaded other countries and occupied them, we've only had like maybe 1, 2, 3 successful attempts out of the 20 plus attempts we've ever had. More than that, but I don't know the exact number. So over time, we've never really had a successful occupation of a nation. It's never been successful. And now we've just wasted almost like a trillion, I think it was over $1 trillion we spent on this war over time, trillions of dollars spent on this war over time. We waste all that money to just have the Taliban come through and take over again. But the whole point of this story is that the Taliban was funded originally by the United States government when they were Mujahideen fighters. And so they've gotten power and they've gotten in power and they've done their training and their all their knowledge of war and United States United States combat training and all of that stuff. That's all because of the United States government funding them because they were anti-Soviet. This whole conflict in Afghanistan, the 20-year war, where children have literally been forced to grow up in a country constantly at war. Children had to grow up in a country that was constantly at war. And that's all because of the United States being so afraid and having so much disdain for socialism, for having a fear of socialism and a fear of the Soviet Union, that they went through and funded the very people that backstabbed them and took over the country that they occupied for 20 years. So next time you consider doing something, next time you consider doing something in the name of fighting socialism or communism, just know that's going to backfire. The United States, anytime it's tried to stop socialism from happening, anytime it's tried to stop communist leaders from taking power, it's never ended in a good way. Vietnam, we went to Vietnam, we lost the war, we had to escape by helicopter over top of the Saigon. I think it was the president's palace. We had to escape from the rooftops of that. Korea, we tried to stop North Korea from becoming, in charge. Didn't work out. We ended up drawing a line right down the middle and calling it that. Yeah, Soviet Union collapsed, but that was partly because the United States was so involved in sabotaging it, and not also because the leaders of towards the end of the Soviet Union's rule, were so much more imperialistic and capitalistic than previous leaders who were in charge. And not to mention, after Stalin, anyone that came in power after Stalin became more and more weak as time went on. It started with Khrushchev. He was pretty weak when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it kept going on. They kept getting weaker and weaker. And then, Soviet Union became more capitalistic, more imperialistic over time. So really, it kind of just over time imploded in itself. And you can't say that socialism was the cause of its downfall, because socialism didn't really exist towards the end of the Soviet Union's existence in that country. So it wasn't socialism that caused it to fall. It was in itself capitalists and imperialist intentions. So what was I saying? The government of the United States, anytime, like I said, the government of the United States, anytime they've tried to invade a country that was turning socialist, or democratically electing a communist leader, they always have to go in and occupy and take over, and it ends up never working. The government itself has failed numerous times to occupy and take over different countries across the world. And this is just one example, and this is a one big major example of why the United States has failed at imperialism. And this is just a disgrace, really, to the American government, and it just shows how much weaker they are on the world scale in terms of influence and power. So it's definitely troubling for the Afghan people who have to suffer at the hands of the Taliban, because the US decided many years ago that socialism should not be allowed in the Middle East or in the world. And thanks to the United States funding these Mujahideen fighters, Afghanistan is now under control of a hyper-religious Taliban. This episode of the Revolution Today podcast is sponsored by the wonderful people on my Patreon who support me every month. If you want to support me, go to patreon.com/revolutiontoday or click the link in the description and consider giving me support. I'd greatly appreciate it. I wanted to move on to this next topic. The last one was talking about imperialism and Afghanistan, but this one I wanted to talk about the Taliban and why they're so evil. Really, the Taliban, it's not complicated. It's pretty simple to understand. The Taliban is like a hyper-religious fundamentalist group. They support Islam to the extreme. They're almost like the hyper-religious Christians in America, the ones who have guns, and the ones who are like almost and like seem like they're in a cult. Kind of like the ones that are like I don't know, just hyper religious. So the Taliban is a hyper religious fundamentalist Islamic group who now has power in Afghanistan after a terrible 20-year war that failed. No thanks to the United States government who funded the Taliban back in the 80s. But anyway, the Taliban is a fundamentalist hyper religious group that now has control, and thanks to that all happening over the past 20 years, they now have the ability to be oppressive once again after having a short stint as control of Afghanistan during the 1996 through 2001 era, short era of the Taliban's first government. Second government is back in power. Taliban, let me tell you this, they're strict on when it comes to religion. The first Taliban government, they said no women are allowed to work, no women are allowed to get an education, women have to wear burqas, women have to be escorted by a guardian or a husband whenever they leave the house. Your typical hyper religious Islamic behavior. They were also very much against technology at first. Like, they were not at all technologically savvy in the first government. They didn't know how to use technology. They didn't really use it much. So for them, it was for that first government, it was very oppressive and very restrictive. What you could say, you couldn't say much. You couldn't do much, especially women. They couldn't do much. But now, the second government is in power. Their second attempt at a government. And this one is more technologically savvy. They're more organized. They know what they're doing. They claim to be more pro-women now. Like, they're letting women get education. They're letting women do certain things like work in the government and do things that they normally couldn't do in the first round. But I find that hard to believe that they're actually going to let women do so much, because they're really fundamentalist and very strict when it comes to like what they believe. So it's kind of hard for me to really believe that they let women do what they want. But let's not talk about that, because it is a problem that they've allowed to happen. It's a problem that they put themselves in, and that we're sitting by watching, women not being allowed to do much, in that society. But I want to talk about the Taliban. The Taliban, I saw a picture. The Taliban, once they've liberated these areas, they've gone to the prisons and they've let out all the prisoners, meaning they've let out the murderers, the rapists, anybody. They just let them out, and so now they roam the streets. And I've heard stories, and I have these news articles here. The Afghanistan, or the Taliban, not the Taliban. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, not the Taliban. This is the Afghanistan allies. So this is the people that were put into power by the United States government. The people put in power by the United States government, the government of Afghanistan. Let's see here. I'm trying to figure out what the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was the government in power during 2004 to 2021. And the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, they had their soldiers, they've had their police officers, and anyone like that. They were put into power by the United States government. And there's stories coming out now, or them coming out in the last recent years. This one's from 2015. U.S. soldiers told to ignore sexual abuse of boys by Afghan allies. So these police officers and these soldiers from the Republic of Afghanistan Army, and the police officers from the government of Afghanistan, of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, they were raping and abusing young boys, and even probably women too, women and children, girls, whoever. They were raping them, torturing them, abusing them, and these U.S. soldiers were told to sit by and just let it happen. They weren't allowed to say anything. They were told to ignore it. Um, Even here, like in this article, the Taliban sexually enslaves women and girls. So it's not just the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan doing these rapings and abuses of children and possibly women too. Um, there were, they were like here in the brutal 1996 to 2001 regime. Women were not allowed to be employed or have an education, forced to wear the burqa, forbidden from leaving their home without a male guardian. Um, the Taliban claims to be more pro women, but the problem is these days they're committing thousands of women to sexual slavery, and what they're doing is, and even this, that at one point they were offering quote unquote wives to try and get militants to join the Taliban. So basically they were just like, it was like a promotional thing. They're like, hey, if you join the Taliban, you can have a choice of who you want as your wife. And really it wasn't consensual. It was forced. It wasn't a marriage at all. It was just quote unquote wives. It wasn't marriage. It was just, hey, you can have this woman and she can be your sexual slave. And so they were just sitting there. They're sitting there taking these women as slaves, and wouldn't you guess it, they're probably raping them, or they probably did, raping them, abusing them, assaulting them, and all the while, these are the people we funded in the 80s. We funded these people in the 80s as the Mujahideen fighters, and now they're the Taliban, and they're committing rape, abuses, sexual slavery. They're against women's rights. And this is all because, hey, we're against socialism. We're against the Soviet Union. So it's okay as long as it's in an effort to combat socialism and Soviet Union. We're okay with women getting raped, women not having rights in Afghanistan, because it's okay. We're fighting socialism. We're doing a good work here. No, you're not. You're sitting there saying that it's morally acceptable to allow these things to happen because you're fighting socialism and fighting the Soviet Union. That's not okay. I mean, sure, you could say, well, oh, but when we funded them back in the day as the Mujahideen fighters, we had no idea they'd turn into the Taliban and start taking over everything. Yes, but why would you fund these people in the first place? You think a bunch of rebel fighters from Afghanistan are going to take your side to the end of the earth? No. They're not going to join our side and stay loyal to the day that they die. That's not going to happen. They're just a bunch of rebel fighters who are looking to take out the Soviet Union and then work on advancing their own goals. So why would you even fund them in the first place? And if anything, we're all like, nowadays everybody's saying, well, we need to stay in Afghanistan. It's all for women's rights. We got to save the women. I'm like, well, the women were doing just fine under the Soviet Union's rule of Afghanistan. So is it really about women's rights? Because if it was about women's rights, you wouldn't have given those Mujahideen fighters weapons to fight anyway in the first place. But hey, I don't know I don't speak for the government. I can't speak about what they've done. It's their choice to speak on it and admit to what they did was wrong, but they choose not to. They stand by, hey, we were doing a good deed fighting the Soviet Union. But in the end, guess what? Now the Taliban came into power and it's all your fault. And then we spent a 20-year war to clean up a mess that we started. And what did it leave us? Trillions of dollars in debt just on the war. We're already trillions of dollars in debt, but that made us even more in debt. No thanks to a problem we started. So, of course, the Taliban's not that great, but also the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan wasn't that great either, because they were letting their soldiers and their police officers rape and abuse little boys um, all the time. And then U.S. soldiers were just told to just ignore it and just be quiet about it and just shut up. So it's definitely complicated, because on the one hand, you have the Taliban, who hates women's rights, who hates women, who abuses and rapes women constantly, all the time. But then on the other hand, you have a U.S. funded and backed government who also allows their own people to abuse and rape little boys. It's despicable that both sides are this evil. I mean, if we would have just stayed away and let the Soviet Union take control of Afghanistan and run things there, it would have gone a whole lot smoother than it was now. Things were looking fine. We didn't need to fund these troops or these Mujahideen fighters, because at the point when the Soviets took control, they were at the point, the Mujahideen fighters were at the point where they were pretty weak. They didn't have much weapons. It didn't seem like they didn't have much weapons or much supplies. So they were pretty, like, very weak, and they didn't have the means to be able to take on the Soviet Union. And if we would have just said, hey, we're not going to fund you and we're going to leave, we're going to stay out of this, they would have collapsed. The Mujahideen fighters would have collapsed. They would have fallen, and everything would have been just A-okay. But thanks to the U.S.'s involvement in stopping the Soviet Union at every cost, at every step of the way, guess what? Now we have to deal with a crisis in Afghanistan where the Taliban now controls everything. And then people here are sitting here there's some people that have the audacity to blame Trump. And some people that have the audacity the Trump supporters are blaming Biden. The Biden supporters are blaming Trump. But there's some people smart enough who are blaming Bush for starting this war. But then there's even smarter people like me who are blaming Reagan and the U.S. government back in the 80s for even funding these fighters who became the Taliban. It's all a big mess, politically and internationally. It's all a big mess. Politically, though, in the United States, it's a big mess because we're trying to pick sides on who's to blame, even though we all know it was the government's fault in the 80s. We should know that, but not a lot of people do. And a lot of people just assume everything is bad because Trump was president. I'm like, no. Capitalism has been terrible even before Trump was president. Our country was falling apart even before Trump was president. Can we just admit that it's the two-party system that has failed us? No, I guess not. I guess to the Trump supporters, Trump is their hero. To the Biden supporters, Biden is their hero. And there's no way of changing their minds and telling them that both sides are the villain. Anyway, that's all I've got for this episode. If you enjoyed, please make sure to give a thumbs up. Please make sure to subscribe. And if you're watching on Apple Podcasts, please make sure to leave a rating, 5 stars, leave a review, and share the podcast with whoever you can. Let's grow this thing and make it big. Also, if you want to support me, links in the description, patreon.com/RevolutionToday. Click the link. Consider supporting. I'd be greatly appreciative of your support, and it would help go a long way in making this podcast big. So, thanks for watching this episode. Tune in next week for the next episode. I'll see you then.